and welcome our presenter, Hack Hudson. He is a literacy coach. He's with the Kentucky Department of Education. I'll briefly tell you a little bit about him. He has been a literacy coach, he has been a librarian, and he's been a teacher. He currently works for the Kentucky Department of Education in the Office of Teaching and Learning as a state literacy coaching specialist. He has a bachelor's degree in elementary education from Morehead State University and a master's degree in library sciences from Eastern Kentucky University. And he's got a lot of great resources to share with you, or you and me this afternoon. So I'm going to turn it over to him. Thank you so much, Hack, for being here.
Thank you. Now you'll know, I know we have people from everywhere, but this is the cornbread section because I do have a little bit of a country dialect, but hopefully you can understand me. Sometimes my closed captioning becomes a little odd, but I'll get right into it. We do have several things on the agenda that I want to just briefly hit. The science of reading is a large body of study, so we won't be able to go through everything, but we're going to hit an introduction, go through some definitions, go through a little brain research, discuss the National Reading Panel report, talk about the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope, and then we'll look at the baseball study and the impact for libraries. So this is my little team up here in the right corner. This is my little Eastern Kentucky KDE team, and we work as literacy coaches in the KYAC area, which is pretty much the southeastern part of the state. Below that are some of my good friends, and I always like to include them in my introduction because we have various backgrounds. We all work in education in some way, but one works in mental health and one works in counseling, and then I work in literacy. And we find that all of those things tend to go together. Literacy really affects mental health. Literacy affects your behaviors. And when we have discussions, we recognize that. This beautiful blonde is my daughter, and that's the reason I work. But I like to also include this picture of my grandparents because they grew up in a time period where teaching people to read was not really emphasized. And, my grandmother went to school about 6th grade. She never really learned to read. She always recognized that held her back in certain ways. And she made sure that all of her daughters went to college and got some amount of college and that they all learned to read. And I think about her when I do this work and how we really have to honor that generation where it was kind of like, a privilege to learn to read. And that really shouldn't be so going forward in the future. So we'll start with a real quick definition, and this came from the Reading League. We do have a Reading League Kentucky chapter that's forming, but it's a nationwide organization. But the Reading League defines science of reading in this way: as a comprehensive body of research that encompasses years of scientific knowledge and spans across many languages and shares the contributions of experts from relevant disciplines such as education and special education and literacy and psychology and neurology and much more. So it's not just about educators. It's truly also about psychology and neurology. And so you'll see it sometimes depicted with this symbol where you have all of these areas forming like this puzzle. And as I was going through and putting these slides together, I thought we really do have to define what is reading, especially for our context today. Sometimes we understand reading to just be that action of just saying the words that are on the page, right? Can we go through and pronounce the words that are on the page? And then I think when you get to this Cambridge dictionary, you get a little bit of a better picture of how we're going to use it today. And it's a skill or activity of getting information or meaning from the book. And so that's what we want to focus on, more than just reading the words on the page. Are we getting any meaning, bringing any meaning to ourselves from that? Let's see. And of course, I love to occasionally just drop in a little quote here, and I loved this one. But and many of you all probably experienced this. Teaching a kid or watching a kid learn to read is evolutionary, one of the most beautiful things that can happen to a parent. And I can remember hearing Abby read when she was a little girl and thinking, oh, thank goodness she's going to make it. There's almost a feeling of relief when you realize this child's going to be able to read. And so now we're going to switch into the brain's research. I want y'all to think about for a minute, is our brain hardwired to speak? And the answer to that is yes. This is considered like biologically primary information. Speaking will be picked up, right? We're hardwired to learn to speak. It's happened for millions of years. So the earliest evidence of human life goes back 2 to 3 million years ago, and there have always been some communication forms. And one of the things we know from science is that's biologically primary information for us to learn to speak, and our brain is hardwired for us to learn that. But are we hardwired to read? And the answer to that actually is no. The earliest evidence of written language goes back around 34 BC. And then, of course, written language wasn't really ubiquitous in the world until after the printing press, and that's not been that long ago. Of course, it's hard for us to imagine now because we have access to so much text and visual information in the world, but it really hasn't been that long that we've had a lot of exposure to text in our world. And so we are not hardwired to read. There's not a brain area that is going to take on that role. But, we are evolving. So we do utilize part of the brain, and it's the same part of the brain that we use to identify faces. And we use that part to distinguish between letters. And then that information then travels to another part of the brain that we connect to that sound and symbol. And so we kind of hijack parts of our brain that we used to use for different things to learn this process of reading. And it's really quite a miraculous thing. One of the latest podcasts that I was listening to, because I'm a really big podcast listener, was which came first, reading or writing? And I really had to think about that. And until the podcaster said, well, you have nothing to read until you write, I thought, oh, yeah, that's true. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. It all started, though, with that spoken language and that communication. But, we had to learn to speak and listen, which was very natural for us. But this reading and writing is not. And we do have to learn how to read and write by using our brain in a different way. So do we expect our students or children to learn to read easily? If you're in education or if you're a parent, think about that question. And the common belief has been for quite some time that learning to read and write is kind of like learning to speak and listen. A lot of people have felt like in in the educational world that, oh, if we expose them to a lot of books and if we read to them all the time, it'll just happen. And for years, we have taken that on and we have done that in classrooms, but it takes a little bit more than that. Remember, we said we were biologically primed to learn to speak? That's not true for reading. Learning to read requires biologically secondary knowledge, so it has to be learned. Now, that doesn't mean no one will learn through just exposure, because we do know that about a third of our learners will learn much more naturally than others. If we put them in those situations where we're surrounding them with books and we're reading to them often, they're going to crack that code and they're going to pick up learning to read and they're going to be fine. But there's quite a few others, probably about 2/3, but they really need explicit instruction on cracking the code of phonics. And so all kids will benefit from phonics instruction, but about 2/3 really have to have it. Remember that the written language and reading is the first experience that children have really in like a two-dimensional world. Most experiences that they have in infancy are really three-dimensional, right? They hold a truck and they can turn the truck, and no matter how they hold it and look at it, it's always a truck. But then we take them to school and we're like, this is a bee and it has to be just this way and it can't be turned and it can't be twisted and you have to make it straight on the page. And so sometimes that is confused with dyslexia with our young kids, but because they can flip things over, they can flip things around whenever they're in the real world. But now we go to school and we have this new, like, okay, things have to be a certain way kind of thing. That's one of the things that makes things difficult for kids. And so we have to give them very direct instruction about letters, letter formation. And so here's another little quote, and this is from Anita Archer. She's one of my favorite educators. There is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact that you can't read words. And we find very typically in education that we like to teach a lot of comprehension strategies, but it can't be done if they can't lift the words off the page. And so we get into this National Reading Panel report, and it really identifies these 5 components of reading. These were 5 essential components of reading. They're essential to instruction for our students in order for them to learn to read and learn to read well. And if you know much about the National Reading Panel report, it really came out of that time period when we had the reading wars. And Congress had said, okay, we need to solve this problem of illiteracy in our nation. We need to find the best methods for teaching literacy. And so it was a huge meta-analysis. It was the largest study of reading research ever. And they came up with these 5 essential components for reading instruction. So there's phonemic awareness and phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. All 5 are essential, and you really can't shortcut any of those. They're all needed. Now, a lot of times, though, we see them represented like this in pillars, like they're all separate. But reading really requires all of these simultaneously. And then comprehension, we see it here and think of it as a separate strategy or a separate element, but really it's more of a product of all the others coming together. Now, we have to provide some instruction with comprehension, but comprehension relies on phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and vocabulary in order for it to occur. And so those 5 components are sometimes a little deceptive when we think of them as being separate things. They're really working all together. When we think about phonemic awareness, we're really thinking about that ability to identify, isolate, manipulate the language and individual sounds at a phoneme level. When we think about phonics instruction, it's the system for teaching reading that focuses on the relationship between letters and sounds. Sometimes we call that a grapheme phoneme correspondence, or a GPC. And what we know is that really students need phonemic awareness in order to do well with phonics instruction, and that those two, building up upon each other, can help a child to be fluent and give them that ability to read text accurately and automatically with expression. Then we get into the vocabulary pillar. We know that there are tiers to vocabulary. Tier 1 vocabulary are really those very basic words, very common words. I think of the Fry and Dulce list, very common high frequency words. But then we have some tier 2 words. These sometimes give students trouble. It sometimes give our kids trouble. These are words that they might encounter across certain content areas, or words that maybe they don't hear as often, but they're fairly common, or they may have multiple meanings, and those can confuse kids. Or in the case in Eastern Kentucky, if you have a dialect and you have some words that don't sound like anything you've seen in print, or words that are very regional, then maybe you don't see them in an academic language. And then you have tier 3 words that are very low frequency and very specific to content. These might be some of your science terminologies or math terminologies. And vocabulary instruction is a very important part of, if you have phonemic awareness, you have phonics, so you can sound through the words and you can read them fluently. Well, it won't do you any good if you don't know what they mean. So you have to have that vocabulary instruction. And then finally, you have some comprehension instruction. As librarians, you all probably know all kinds of ways to reinforce comprehension. But it really just refers more to strategies that students can use effectively to comprehend what they've read. And of course, the National Reading Panel report identified these as very effective means, and that was summarizing, graphic organizers, learning about story structure, generating questions, and answering questions. So here's our next little quote. Putting a book in the hands of a poor reader and then assigning them to read silently 20 minutes a day does not teach a child to read. It may, however, teach them to dislike reading. And I know I've been there as a classroom teacher where I have said, oh, it's time for silent reading. And I knew that probably some of those kids were just looking at the book. It's much, much better to teach them to read, or to even read to them. So we're in our next part now with our simple view of reading. This is probably the easiest way to explain how all of those studies of science of reading come together. And this came about this was made in 1986. So it predates the National Reading Panel report. And it is a simple view of reading, but it's not simple. So the simple view of reading says that if we have word recognition, and those are things like we can pronounce the word, we can recognize the letters, we can connect the phoneme graphemes, we can decode, and we can multiply that by our word meaning. Like we have background knowledge about the word, we have some listening comprehension around that, and we know what the word means. Then that equals our comprehension, our understanding of the text. Now, if it is a multiplication problem for a reason, because what happens when we multiply by 0? We get 0. So if you cannot decode any of the words on the page, but you know what they all mean, well, 0 times 1 is still going to be 0. You're not going to be able to comprehend if you can't read the words on the page or lift the words from the page. But the same is true if you can read all of the words. If you can pronounce them, say them, and at least decode them, but you really don't know what they mean. This happens to me like if I'm trying to read in a foreign language. I can say the word on the page from that foreign language, but if I don't have the word meaning, I'm still not going to comprehend. And so we really have to be able to decode the words and have an idea of their meaning in order to comprehend. And this really gives us an idea here that comprehension is an outcome. It's not a separate skill or strategy. It's the outcome of the skills that we put in place, of our decoding and our vocabulary. And this even happens if we can partly do things. And we know with a lot of our kids, they can read half of the words on the page. But if you can read half of the words and you only know what half of those mean, well, you're still only going to be able to understand about 25% of that. So could we comprehend with a quarter of the understanding that we need? And then think about that in terms of if you knew 7 out of every 10 words and could decode 7 out of every 10, that sounds like quite a bit, right? And if you knew what 7 out of 10 of those words meant, that sounds like that's the majority of them. But when you multiply those together, you've got about 50% comprehension. And it's really hard to understand a passage if you only have about a 50% comprehension rate. And you look at this even at the level of like 9 out of 10 words. If there's just one word in a passage that you can't understand, that you can't lift off the page, and one word that you don't know the meaning to, you're at about 80% comprehension. And that can really affect our kids or young readers, even us as adults. And I think we can take an example here. I thought I had this. So on the left is a coded paragraph where you can't decode part of it. Anybody want to try to read it out loud? That's probably a big no. So the problem here on the left is the decoding, correct? If you can't decode, you can't make sense. And we would even say sometimes, oh, well, what's the main idea? Well, it's really hard for a kid to know a main idea if they can't read it. Now, that same paragraph is on the right, but in this case, I've made it a word you could decode. I mean, you could say a flipper is a tool for finding a quirk. So you have that decoding section, but now we're worried about word meaning. And anybody have an idea of what the main idea here is? Now, note in this paragraph, there are only 10 unknown words. It's about 30% of the paragraph, so you know 70% of it. This is what happens when our kids are learning to read. There are either words they can't decode or words they don't know the meaning. And even we as adults struggle to comprehend when we cannot decode a word or when we don't know a word meaning. And so here's our Frederick Douglass quote before we get into our next section. And it is, once you learn to read, you will be forever free. And I think about this with my grandmother, who never learned to read and always felt like she was in some way trapped because she just didn't have that opportunity. So let's get into Scarborough's reading rope and go back and think about that National Reading Panel report and that simple view of reading, because a lot of times Science of Reading advocates are considered to be the phonics people, but that's far from all of the picture. The phonics is important. Phonemic awareness and phonics is definitely one of the first things that needs to come. But the language comprehension, the word meaning, has to be there also. And hopefully you got that from the National Reading Panel report's 5 components and the simple view of reading. Scarborough's reading rope is just another depiction of that really ties it together in a little more complex way. This reading rope at the bottom, I think I broke it. Yeah. It is broken down into two parts. At the bottom is the word recognition part. That's your decoding part. And then at the top, you have your language comprehension. That's where your word meaning parts come in. So very similar idea as the simple view of reading. If we want to look a little harder at the bottom of the rope, these are our decoding skills. So this is where you get phonemic awareness, phonics, sight recognition. These are the skills that are usually addressed in K2. And for my purposes at work, that's where I work the most, is really trying to build those foundational skills for K2. A lot of times in the later grades, the focus is more on word recognition, morphology, syllabication rules, and things like that when you're in this word recognition area. Notice the arrow about increasingly automatic. That is practice. So the more they practice weaving these things together, right, the more increasingly automatic it becomes, the tighter the connections become, the quicker those brain connections start to set in. That bottom part of the rope is where our children need structured and explicit and systematic phonics. We know from research that the most effective types of phonics instruction are synthetic phonics, and that children need to learn the code of the language and then use the code to synthesize the text by applying it to probably a decodable book. Now, that's a very different approach than maybe you've learned with, or like I was learned, where we had more of like an embedded phonics lesson or an analytic phonics lesson where we started with the text and we would analyze the text to break the code. That has not been found to be near as effective. I mean, it's not that no one will ever learn that way, but it's not as effective as synthetic phonics, where you teach the code and then you use what you've learned to synthesize the text and apply the code. That's why decodable texts are a really big part of structured literacy, because you're actually applying a phonetic principle. And we want to practice to the point of automaticity. We want things to be automatic to where that you can just read it without thought, right? When we're driving down the road, if we see a sign, you will read it without trying at this point in your life, because you can't not read it. Anytime you see a written word, you can read the word without thinking. That is not true until we've practiced to this point of automaticity. Now, that's important for our kids to practice until it becomes automatic, because it will help them eventually with our comprehension. If you see the left, you have our less fluent reader. So if the child is struggling to decode, they're using all of this orange part of their brain to do the decoding. Well, they don't have a lot left over for comprehension. But once they have practiced and built their decoding skills to a level of automaticity, it can really relieve that cognitive load. And so over here on the right, where we have the more fluent reader, well, they still have to use some brain activity to decode, but it's far less, and then they have much more that they can devote to comprehension. That's why teaching those phonics skills in the early primary, in those K's and 1s, really helps our young readers by the time they're in second and third. Now we look at the top part of our rope. Remember, we said this was a lot like our simple view of reading. The bottom was the decoding, the top is the word meanings and the language comprehension. So this is where we need knowledge of literacy. This is where we need verbal reasoning. We need to know about language structures. We need to have vocabulary knowledge, background knowledge. And the great thing about this, especially for librarians, because you all do a lot of read alouds and things, but uh, a lot of it starts before kids even get in school. And it's built through conversations they have, conversations at home, conversations about books, conversations about life or topics or content. But a lot of our language comprehension can be built through talking and letting them talk, right? It's gained a lot through read alouds in school, and it can be gained through read alouds in the library. The more exposure that they have, the more they'll gain in meanings. And so, before we switch to the baseball study, here's our next quote, and it's a room without books is like a body without a soul. Oh, how true. And so now we get into this baseball study, and I think libraries are probably really important to everyone when we think about this. But the baseball study came about in 1987, and they took, I'm pretty sure it was fourth grade students, but they took some really good readers, and they took some readers that were kind of struggling, and then they put really good readers who knew a whole lot about baseball. And then they had some readers who didn't know much about baseball, which would have been me. I would have been the I don't know about baseball one. And they studied the good readers and the struggling readers to see how they did with reading a passage about baseball and summarizing it. And so this is what they found. So here we see our poor readers who knew a lot about baseball over here on the left did almost as well as our good readers who knew a lot about baseball. And the poor readers who didn't know much about baseball didn't do much differently than the students who were really good readers who didn't know much about baseball. So what this taught us was that knowledge is important, right? Reading ability has some effect by the time you're in fourth grade, but readers really also need knowledge in order to truly understand. Ah, I edited this last one. We'll have to skip that. I was going to go back to it, but I didn't read my whole thing about having animations until just the other day. But anyway, I was going to go back to our activity, but if you were curious, that passage was about compass and finding a direction. So let's go back to our Nita Archer quote before we get into some impacts for libraries. The biggest act of kindness is that we teach so well that our students learn and are successful, and that our mission, that is our mission, and that is your superpower. And it truly is an act of kindness to know that a child can read and that they're going to be successful. It sets them up for success in so many different ways. And so here are some impacts of libraries or things we should at least keep in mind. I know our public library does a lot of work with Countdown to Kindergarten and preparing kids for kindergarten. Students should enter kindergarten with a conversational vocabulary of about 10,000 words for success. So they should have at least been exposed to it. They can probably speak it. They could at least understand those words in conversation. But we also know that children who live in poverty typically enter schools with about 4,000 words in their conversational vocabulary. And I'm sure, like most areas, I mean, this county has a high rate of poverty. Our kids come to school with a lower conversational vocabulary than they really need to be successful. The number of words that children learn varies greatly. And so this is just a little quick comparison here of 2 words versus 8 words per day. If a child learns 2 words per day, that's going to be about 750 in a year. But if they're learning 8 words per day, you get up to 3,000 in a year. And that's a pretty significant difference when you're considering that really 10,000 words upon kindergarten is a benchmark for success. And then this is always an interesting statistic, and I've heard various things about, oh, that's now been debunked or it's not true, but in the book Meaningful Differences, the Everyday Experiences of Young Adult Children, it was found that by age 3, the children in professional families would have heard, now not learned, but just heard and been exposed to more than 30 million words. And then the children of working class families would have 20 million, and children in welfare around 10 million, which is quite staggering. That's quite amazing to me. And so for a library, we want to really expand that conversational vocabulary, right? Through a lot of rich conversation. We know that at home, they're going to hear a lot of the same kind of terminology and vocabulary. And when they come to the library, we can really broaden that. We can use more descriptive adjectives or more expressive words than maybe they would hear on a normal basis at home. And maybe really think about academic language and using some of those language words that they may see in print more often, right? And then we need to encourage them to use those words in conversation during our activities. And it can be conversations with adults, it could be conversations with peers. Even our little preschoolers like to talk to adults and like to talk to each other. And I'm sure as librarians, you all do this quite well, but you build in those great pause points and read alouds and pose questions, but then maybe add that part where you give them time to discuss with a partner or discuss with a parent or a guardian. The next part is drawing on that vocabulary of rich text and really explaining word meanings. You know, that was one of those components of reading that's very important. It's also important for a simple view of reading where they know the meaning of words, and we can help to build their vocabulary and their word meaning knowledge. I always think this is important, and sometimes we forget because as adults, we don't realize how confusing some words are, but try to draw out and bring attention to these easily confused words in a text. It can be very confusing to a child if they hear sent and sense and sense, but then they're not seeing it in print, and we're not drawing attention to the similarities and the differences, like the similarities in the sounds, but the differences in the meanings and the usage. And so that's something we could do as we do our read alouds, and discuss multiple meanings of words and how context can help us provide information that we need. And then this also recognizing and exploring how dialect or regional lexicons can affect a meaning. And I know it's often pointed out this difference between a buggy and a cart, because when I was a little boy, we would just get a shopping buggy, and then I didn't know really what a cart was when I was reading it, so I thought that was very interesting. But I always get tickled at myself with sugar, because we had, sugar that you would put in your cookies, but you also might want Granny to give you some sugar on the cheek. But then Grandma would talk about our poor old Aunt Myrtle, who had the sugar and they had to take off her foot. And then she would say, now come here, let me give you some sugar. And I thought, well, I want to keep my foot. I don't think I want you to give me sugar. But we do have to think about How are we using all of these words, and how confusing might that be to a child? And I'm sure you all do this quite well because I know our public library had wonderful story times. I have to brag on them because they are amazing. They were always a wonderful help to me when I was a district literacy specialist. But um, having a well constructed story time that has songs and rhymes and stories and introduces the kinds of phonetic and language skills that are already proven to support literacy is really important for our young kids. When you all have, your youngest kids in there for story time, leverage those songs and nursery rhymes and all of those things because they are really beneficial, especially for phonemic awareness. Um, it's also model expressive and fluent reading in your activities. Parents often try, but sometimes they may not have the best grasp of how to model fluent reading. So they can get that in their library at their story time. Uh, Talk about and discuss story elements with young readers. I think this is really important for us as librarians. I'm always quite amazed when I work with teachers. They sometimes don't know story elements or they don't know them deeply, right? And they sometimes may not understand reading a narrative is very different than reading something informational, and that you really need to put a different kind of like hat on when you're reading a narrative than informational. So if you can talk about those things with our young readers, it'll set them up for making that determination when they're reading. And then add some decodable text to your collection. Some of you may already have them, or some of y'all may be able to expand on them. I know that they're becoming much more popular now. I did want to put this slide in just to kind of define it, but um, in some ways, all texts are considered decodable, or otherwise you couldn't read them, right? But for the definition of decodable text, it's really dependent on instruction. And decodable text refers to text that contain words and spelling patterns or specific words that have been explicitly taught. Now, you probably don't have a situation where you can explicitly teach a, a phonetic principle, but think about this in terms of a typical scope and sequence for a class will include, like in first grade, they're going to hit CVC words first, right? And a lot of decodable text that you can purchase now will have some kind of a typical phonics scope and sequence basis to it. So in general, we consider a text to be decodable if it's above 70% of that typical scope and sequence. I think Texas might be the only state where there's a true, like the legislature has said, it has to be, I think, 80% before it can be considered decodable. But typically, we look at about 70%. It is a good idea to balance your activities between information and literary reading. We know that knowledge is important, right? We saw that in the baseball study. I know from my experience when I was an elementary librarian, I probably focused really heavy on the literary reading. If I had it to do over, I would have tried to balance that out again. We do have a lot of great nonfiction texts now that are still geared towards our lower level readers that we could leverage to build knowledge. So take opportunities to build knowledge with your young readers and then discuss elements with them, informational text about purpose and captions and photos and text structures. Um, it's never too early to really introduce them to some of these complex ideas around our text. And then develop a collection that'll assist you in building knowledge. Sometimes it's really hard to find lower level knowledge building books. But I feel like publishers are catching on and they're publishing more and more. Familiarize yourself with how reading is being taught in your communities and schools. Parents will probably come in and ask questions about it. The Read to Succeed Act was passed in 2022, and it has really put an emphasis on structured literacy. So, being familiar with structured literacy would be beneficial because it may be something different than what these parents experienced when they were in school, right? And we know that caregivers may come to the library and look for materials that are similar. They may be looking for decodable text, or they may be looking for books about ways to prevent reading difficulties. And there are some great resources online for that as well. The Reading League has a lot of great resources. The Florida Center for Reading Research has some wonderful activity resources. And then we have some on our Department of Education's Division of Early Literacy page. I have some links there. And of course, our Dale page has a structured literacy page. We have a read at home plan family guide that has tons of activities, and there's a QR code there, and that's really what the read at home plan guide looks like. And I've made it just 1 minute over to our last slide. So our final quote is, in the case of good books, the point is not to see how many of them you can get through, but rather how many can get through to you.
Thank you, Hack. I had lost my mouse, but I have gotten it back. So thank you for sharing, folks. Do you have any questions? This was I really appreciate the examples you gave, the sugar, 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 and the scent, and I was thinking even scent with the smell,
Yes.
SCT too, and talking that activity you did. So thank you for that. What I guess if anybody has questions, you can put those in the chat. One question I had, we've listed the resources you shared with us, but are there specific publishers that you know that offer books? I know, I think of some of the capstone books from when I was in libraries. They have like the Pebble and those. I don't know what publishers. Are there any publishers you could suggest?
I'm trying to think right off. You know what? I haven't been a librarian in 7 years now, and I would hate to say because I haven't done book orders in so long. My
Understand.
goodness.
It's been 4
Yeah.
years for me since I do a different kind of collection development now. So yeah.
I
Um,
feel like though even some of our publishers who were doing more balanced literacy are
mhm.
starting to develop uh, more decodable text that are geared towards the scope and sequence.
Okay.
Because it is, I mean, nationally, this move towards structured literacy is on the rise.
Gotcha.
So uh, everybody's kind of getting on board.
Mhm.
I might ask the Reading League. They are a wealth of knowledge. I can try to
Okay.
find out.
Well, and I know you've given us a lot of great resources, so I just that was. And then we actually have another question in the chat. Do you have any tips to help adult patrons who are trying to learn to read? That's yeah.
Yeah. Um, the the Florida Center for Reading Research starts with some phonemic awareness phonics lessons. It's really hard sometimes for adults to gauge where to start because the problem could be anywhere along the way, right? It could be phonics, but it could be fluency. It could be fluency because of phonics, or it could be vocabulary and knowledge. There are a core phonics survey. It's a free online assessment. Could help you determine, like, is it a phonetic deficiency? I might can find a link real quick. Um, and I mean, it's a very simple. It's a free resource. And then if they're fine with the core phonics survey and they're hitting benchmark on all of those, then it's probably going to be one of those things where we really need like fluency. Are they reading fluently? And of course, there's Hasbrook Tyndall has fluency scales for like school age kids, but I mean, typically, if they need to read over 100 words in a minute to be able to comprehend, um, or it could be vocabulary. A lot of times, what happens is if you go back to that automaticity slide, if the brain power is used on the decoding, then they really can't spend that cognitive energy on the comprehension part.
Any other questions? Very good questions, and I'm typing in the chat, Nicole, but thank you for asking the question, and then it sounds like you are making an effort. You all are helping. You're at least connecting her with some
Yeah,
some books. I know that's she's an adult and will want to read things that are adult books, but thank you for what you're doing to help this
and
woman. I'm sorry, Nick.
yeah, practice will be very important. Regular practice and starting with third grade is fine because it will build those little connections in the brain that will make it more and more automatic as she goes.
I have just dropped. Yeah. Well, you care about her though, Nicole. It seems like if you're asking, I want to encourage you. Keep up the good work. I just dropped Hack's contact information in the chat, and Hack, did you have another slide you wanted to share? I don't want to.
No, I think that's
Okay.
all.
Oh,
that's just resources that I'd used.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, were you a librarian or was sharing your citations and so forth? I really appreciate you teaching us today and the pacing and all that you shared. I do want to thank you again, and I'm also going to thank the Institute for Museum and Library Services. We have a separate slide for that we've got to share. So bear with me as I get that loaded up. Institute of Museum and Library Services provides funding that makes the KYAC conference available. And if you all have any other questions, you can reach out to Hack. The slides are available in the learning portal, so you can access those. And if you don't have access to the learning portal, let me put in the chat here a way you can access those. Amy will be glad to share those with you. And put that in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here and participating in the KYAC 2024 conference. Hack, it was a pleasure to get to learn from you today. Thank you so much.